Emrakul, the Aeons Torn. A creature with so much text, you gotta squint just a little bit to read it. I'm sure the editors had to go ham on that decrease font size button just to fit all of this onto a single magic card. But let's go ahead and give it a try. Here we go. It can't be countered. When it's cast, you take an extra turn after this one. It has flying, protection from colored spells, and Annihilator 6. And when Emrakul, the Aeons Torn, is put into the graveyard from anywhere, its owner shuffles their graveyard into their library. All for the low and totally reasonable cost of 15 mana. Good gravy. This is a really unique card, one that fairly balances what it does, which, let's be honest, it wins you the game the second it resolves, with a cost that reflects that potential. When you think of a single card that costs 15 mana, I mean, it better win you the game, right? Now, all players had to do is to find a way to cheat it out. And sadly for you Reanimator fans out there, you can't rely on graveyard shenanigans because it'll just be shuffled right back into your deck.
Smithies, are they booing me?
No, they're saying boo earns, boo earns.
Over the course of MTG's history, players at the highest level of deck construction had to be a bit more creative when handling Emrakul, the Aeons Torn. But did they manage to make it work competitively? How good was Emrakul, the Aeons Torn actually? Emrakul, the Aeons Torn was introduced to Magic with the rise of the Eldrazi expansion in April of 2010. At the time, this monstrously sized creature was tied with Worldspine Worm as the biggest non-token creature in MTG history. It was also the second highest costing creature, after Draco, a card from Planeshift, but let's be honest here, Emrakul is quite a bit better. With these two groundbreaking achievements, this creature immediately became the center of conversation within the professional community on how one could break it to make its insane casting cost work in Standard. Players knew if they could engineer some way to cheat Emrakul, the Aeons Torn into play early, they would most certainly win the game. This creature is really hard to play around, as it can't be countered and has protection from colored spell, which are the vast majority of spells out there. Its Annihilator 6 meant that when it attacked in, well, it's almost like a one-sided Wrath of God on a stick. Because Annihilator triggers during the Declare Attacker phase, the opposing player can't even assign blockers unless, heaven forbid, they have more than 6 permanents to choose from. No board state could survive through this, it's just way too powerful. But what if, and just think like a player back in 2010 here for a moment, what if you don't cheat this into play from your hand? You hardcast it. That's right, like a G, pay the 15 and get an extra turn after this one. Forget Summoning Sickness, forget some possible answer to Emrakul during your opponent's turn. Win as soon as it's played. This was the Golden Goose, the Holy Grail. This was the dream during Rise of the Eldrazi Standard. So, how did players do it, and did it succeed? If Emrakul, the Aeons Torn was to succeed in Standard, it was going to need some tools to help offset that high cost. For the Zendikar block at the time, this came in the form of lands that were made specifically to help cast these huge Eldrazi spells. This was primarily seen on cards like Eldrazi Temple and the legendary land Eye of Ugin, which rather than producing mana, simply reduced the cost of Eldrazi spells by 2, but with the added fetch ability to grab Emrakul from the deck when you're ready to play it. Sure, that ability costs 7 mana, but compared to the 15 of Emrakul, it was downright reasonable. The key to running this deck back in Standard was ramp. Mana dorks, playing extra lands, digging for lands from the library, anything that could get Emrakul out faster was needed. That's why the most successful of these decks at a competitive level ran it with green spells that often helped facilitate extra mana. Creatures like Joraga Treespeaker were cheap ways to help ramp very quickly. Overgrown Battlement played a similar role in this deck, acting as a cheap body that could produce a multitude of mana. Man, the dream of having 4 of these bad boys out at the same time, producing 16 mana total. They could summon Emrakul all by their viney selves. And of course, no green ramp deck back in 2010 would be complete without Primeval Titan, who at this point needs little explanation, but it's just a big old land fetching machine. There wasn't a lot of nuance to this deck, dubbed the Eldrazi Green. Ramp and search for your singular copy of Emrakul, the Aeons Torn, hardcast it with your literal jungle of mana, and win. It was that easy. The hard part was stabilizing the board as you get everything in place. Standard at the time had to contend with powerful combo and control decks, which would severely slow down a player's ramp potential. Still, despite that, this was seen as a legitimate deck at the time, but one that didn't get as much success as this total unit of a win condition deserved. During its standard lifetime, from April of 2010 to September 2011, Emrakul the Aeons Torn saw only minor showings in this Eldrazi Green deck in only a few high-level tournaments. It cracked the top 8 with a deck played by Mike Potenti at Star City Games Open Richmond, with that tournament seeing similar decks breaking into the top 16. It would again find some success at the Worlds 2010 tournament with a deck piloted by Love Jancy breaking into the top 3. And Emrakul finally scored a top place showing at Nationals 2011 Great Britain in a deck played by Daniel Royd. Though Emrakul the Aeons Torn in this green ramp deck had potential, in practice it just didn't keep up with more well-established and aggressive combo decks that already littered the metagame of the day. Still, with a one-card win condition like this, as it rotated into Modern, people were determined to break Emrakul to its full potential. As Emrakul the Aeons Torn entered into the Modern scene, the card and the decks that used it carried on the philosophy it had in Standard. Play Emrakul from your hand, and if you swing in, you win the game. The faster this was done, the more effective the deck. The first major decks to play around with this creature were Tron decks, which, if you're not familiar, are decks designed to ramp up colorless mana extremely quickly through the Urza land cycle, with 4 copies of each of Urza's Mine, Urza's Power Plant, and Urza's Tower. You can start to see how quickly one could produce mana and in the large quantities needed to play this 15 mana spell. Thanks to this deluge of colorless mana, Emrakul wasn't the only high-ticketed creature that could win Tron deck games. Wormcoil Engine and even another Eldrazi Titan, Ulamog the Infinite Gyre, were other early inclusions to this deck. From February 2012 to January 2016, some version of Tron decks running Emrakul the Aeons Torn placed top 8 across 41 different high-level tournaments. Louis Scott Vargas was one of the first with his blue-white variation of the deck that placed top 8 at Grand Prix Lincoln in 2011. From there, it again placed top 3 at Grand Prix Kobe in 2014, with a deck played by Yuki Akaboshi. Emrakul Tron would snag its first top showing at SCG Premier Philadelphia with a deck by Thomas Riker, and would again place first at both SCG Modern Open Columbus and the Invitational at Columbus. However, this deck soon fell out of fashion as a key element of the Emrakul Tron decks, Eye of Ugin, was banned in Modern on April 4th, 2016. This ban came as a response to the dreaded Eldrazi Winter, a dark time in the Modern format following the ban of Splinter Twins, which opened the door for this much more aggressive style of Eldrazi deck to fill the void. Using Eye of Ugin and cheaper, more versatile Eldrazi creatures such as Thought-Knot Seer and Reality Smasher, the Eldrazi Winter saw 75% of the decks in the top 8 of Pro Tours being some flavor of this aggro Eldrazi. Now, Emrakul the Aeons Torn wasn't used in those decks during the Eldrazi Winter, but it still had previously relied on Eye of Ugin to help it be played faster. Now, with its banning, there was a consequence. Modern players had to look elsewhere. But luckily, a new Planeswalker appeared on the scene that offered a greater control element, while also fishing and ultimately finishing off the opponent with one big Emrakul swing. Nahiri Control had taken control over the Modern scene. Much like Sorin's ancestral home of Markov Manor, Nahiri the Harbinger blew up people's expectations of Emrakul the Aeons Torn. Unlike the Plane of Innistrad, though, this creature was pulled from the ashes and given new purpose, rather than, you know, what Nahiri did to Sorin. All stuck in a rock and whatnot. Nahiri Control had a simple philosophy: control, control, control. Use spells like Path to Exile, Lightning Bolt, and Lightning Helix to control the board, Spell Snare and Mana Leak to control opponents' spells, and force Snapcaster Mages to play all those tools over again. All in an effort to play and protect Nahiri the Harbinger, who's on a 2-turn ticker to win you the game. The Planeswalker's -8 ability is realistic to pull off, as it comes into play with 4 loyalty counters already and has a +2 ability. Hitting her ultimate, you can fish for your soul copy of Emrakul the Aeons Torn and swing in. Annihilator 6 should be enough to seal you the game, even if you don't get that sweet extra turn afterwards. Nahiri the Harbinger acted a lot like the card Through the Breach, which was often paired with Emrakul the Aeons Torn. The downside was you did have to protect this Planeswalker, but it also didn't require any other combo pieces or Emrakul to be in your hand. So while they both filled the same role, cheating Emrakul into play with haste, Nahiri could more reliably do it all on her own. Nahiri and Emrakul teamed up for a few top 16 showings at Grand Prix Charlotte and Los Angeles in 2016, while also taking the #1 spot at SCG Indianapolis with a deck played by Peter Ingram. It didn't have as much success as Tron did in its heyday, but it still managed to make the top 8 of many prestigious tournaments like WMCQ China, Star City Games Modern in Dallas, and Grand Prix Brisbane in 2017. As is the nature of Modern, Nahiri and Emrakul's time in the spotlight was short-lived. Tron decks still did a similar thing, but had more big creatures to choose from without so much removal clogging the deck. Nahiri itself was problematic because at 4 mana and 2 turns, it was a tad slow for a Modern meta that looked to establish a win from that 4 mana. And lastly, if you drew Emrakul from your library in this deck, you would essentially lose the game. It's gotta be in your deck for Nahiri to fetch it, so it's a straight negative top deck. These factors combine to close the prevalence of Emrakul the Aeons Torn in Modern, but not before it showed that even cards deemed too costly to play could find a home so long as you have the right pieces around it. Though Emrakul the Aeons Torn has been overshadowed by newer, more flashy Eldrazi cards, that's not to say that even today people aren't experimenting with one of the hardest win conditions in Magic the Gathering's history. Today you can see what are known as Blue Moon decks floating around the Modern format. It's essentially a landlocked deck that denies your opponent the use of their fancy non-basic lands with Blood Moon, while you yourself get out an Emrakul with a card like Through the Breach. It's awesome to see huge creatures like this get some love in Eternal formats, when in conventional thinking, in Standard anyway, they're just not effective when compared to more value creatures who just balance a decent body for a cheaper price, but can ultimately win you the game faster. Yeah, having a quote-unquote reasonable mana curve is the quote-unquote correct way to build a deck, sure.
You are technically correct. The best kind of correct.
Whatever. It will never beat, in my heart anyway, comboing off or finding some creative way to slam an opponent with a big old space octopus monster and watch their despair as they debate which 6 permanents they gotta sack. It's a feeling that we just can't define in Magic the Gathering. I want to thank you all so much for watching this MTG essay video. If you enjoyed it and want to support our content on the channel, please consider throwing it a like, becoming a subscriber, and of course sharing it with friends. It all goes a long way in helping us grow this community. You can also support our work by checking out our Patreon or becoming a channel member, the proceeds of which go right back into our videos, namely our editor who does an amazing job here.
Ow! I'm hungry.
As always guys, until next time, see ya!